Welcome to this presentation and thank you for your time to listen to it. The purpose of this presentation is to define and expose the transformation domain, understand how strategically important it is, and to propose a way forward to assess your enterprise's transformation maturity, which is the first step in deciding whether it is worth spending any time or money on maturing any part of it. My name is Kevin Lee Smith, the founder of Pragmatic EA and the CEO of Pragmatic Enterprise Consulting. I have spent over 35 years of my life working in and helping to mature the transformation capabilities of companies all over the world. Pragmatic EA is a research company developing pragmatic best practice. The best practice we have developed contributes to the existing best practice that relates to enterprise transformation, such as Prince2, MSP, TOGAF, etc. Pragmatic EC is a consulting company which uses any appropriate best practice, whether developed by Pragmatic EA or not, to help enterprises mature any or all parts of their transformation capability from strategy to deployment. The best practice frameworks that Pragmatic EA has developed, such as POET and PEAF, are used all over the world. First, we're going to be setting some context. Second, we'll cover some definitions. And third, we'll talk about the workshop. So let's start with some context. Why are we talking about this? Why is it important? First, we must realise and accept that many of us use the same word for different things and different words for the same thing. And so I may use words in ways that don't agree with the definitions you are used to. Please bear with me, and for the purposes of understanding this presentation, do an internal mapping in your head whenever I use a word in a way that you don't normally use it. A good example is the word transformation. When I use this word, I'm not referring to a specific type of change like large or life-changing, for example. I'm just using the word transformation as a generic word to refer to any type of change. We all spend time looking forward, wanting new things. We think that the solutions to all problems come from thinking about them. But sometimes it's a good idea to look to the past to see what we can learn. Sometimes we can learn more about our problems, sometimes we can learn more about solutions. These words are very old, but perfectly embody both the problem and solution with respect to the transformation domain of many enterprises. Sage words indeed. Sage words that are largely being ignored. Do you think the rate of change on the outside of your enterprise exceeds the rate of change of your enterprise today, next year? Do you think your enterprise is more or less adaptable than your competitors today? Next year, in 5 years' time? What new thinking is your enterprise employing today, will employ next year, in 5 years' time? If you ignore these sage words, what do you think your enterprise will look like in 5 years? If you ignore these sage words, do you think your enterprise will still exist in 5 years? This illustrates the normal view of how many view an enterprise. People who work in the business see their domain as the most important, and IT as a separate entity which supports the business, and is often shown or thought of as underneath the business, and therefore viewed as in some way subservient. Yes, IT only exists to support the business, but in the 21st century, this business myopic view is flawed, as IT is an integral part of the business. People who work in IT see their domain as the most important, and the business as everything else that is not IT. Yes, IT is a major part of the business, but in the 21st century, this IT myopic view is flawed, as the business is an integral part of IT. This illustrates the pragmatic view of how people, especially those that direct enterprises, should view their enterprise. This new way of looking at the fundamental structure of an enterprise is a paradigm shift. Instead of looking at the enterprise from the point of view of its major parts, we look at the enterprise from the point of view of strategically important wholes that are made up of parts. What is of strategic importance is the end-to-end effectiveness, efficiency, agility and sustainability of these wholes: direction, operation, transformation and support. A little history though. In the beginning, IT did not exist and therefore was not represented in enterprises at all. But eventually IT came into being and enterprises started to see the value in using it. Over time, as IT grew, it logically got to the point where the enterprise required an IT department to handle it, and hence IT departments were born. These IT departments were essentially bolted onto the side of whatever currently existed in the enterprise. At first, no one on the board knew what to do with this growing IT department, or who should oversee it, and so the IT department was often placed under other support areas such as HR or finance. As the IT department and IT complexity grew, it became clear the HR or finance director did not have the knowledge to manage it effectively, and hence the birth of the IT director, CTO, CIO type roles. Initially, although on the board, the people appointed to these roles were often not seen as proper directors most of the time, and instead were tolerated more as a necessary evil. As time moved on, and with the ever-increasing use and complexity of IT, these roles gained prominence and understanding and were made and accepted to be proper board-level positions. However, these IT departments are still largely a chunk bolted onto the side of the enterprise, as they were when IT first came to be used. This is the general state of play today. So, we are not saying that enterprises were wrong to think and organising themselves as in Plate A. That was a reasonable way of thinking and organising themselves in the past. In fact, it was the rational, reasonable and logical way of thinking and organising themselves. But we have moved from a world where IT didn't exist and was optional to a world where IT is pervasive and mandatory. So, this is no longer an IT thing, this is a transformation thing. We need a paradigm shift from thinking in terms of the business and IT to thinking in terms of direction, operation, transformation and support. Pragmatic asserts that every enterprise consists of 4 distinct conceptual parts, which 1 are the most fundamentally important to the board and the sustainability of the enterprise, 2 require totally different people, mindsets and culture, 3 totally completely define all enterprises without overlaps or gaps. Direction is that part which exists solely to provide direction and leadership to the rest of the enterprise. This is where the C-suite, partners and executive management team generally sit, working on things like the vision, mission, goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, business models and operating models, etc. Operation is that part which exists solely to fulfill that enterprise's mission and thereby helping to fulfill its vision. For example, doing banking, drilling oil wells, treating patients, etc. Transformation is that part which exists solely to transform the enterprise. If the enterprise never needed to change, this area would simply not exist. Support is that part which exists solely for the purposes of dealing with problems and issues from the rest of the enterprise and from customers and suppliers outside the enterprise. Most enterprises have an IT support function, where tickets are generated and problems go through first and second line support. But most enterprises also deal with other types of problems, such as when employees have problems with their holiday entitlements or paychecks. These are problems that deserve to be handled in the same way as IT problems, where a ticket is raised and managed until the problem is resolved. Doing so would be much more efficient. But the maturity of support is open for another discussion. Transformation is, of course, our focus here. Pre-20th century enterprises didn't change much. After being created, they pretty much stayed as they were. Their viability just depended on what they did, the era of operations. During the latter part of the 20th century, what an enterprise did was not enough anymore to distinguish them. Their viability not only depended on what they did, but how they did it. For example, what distinguished the banks was not what they did, because they all did the same thing, it was how they did what they did that distinguished them. Therefore, improving what they did became a strategic benefit, and vast amounts of money were poured into transformation projects to do so. Resources were not really an issue, just being able to change kept them ahead. the era of the transformation of operations. In today's world, the pressure for enterprises to change is immense and grows day by day. It comes from internal pressures, which are largely under the control of the enterprise, but it also comes from external pressures, which are largely not under the control of the enterprise, such as changing markets, changing customer segments, legislation, regulation, business models, not to mention the inexorable advances in IT that only ever seem to accelerate. So, in today's world, just being able to deal with change is not enough. What distinguishes enterprise these days is how they change. That is to say, how effective and efficient they are doing transformation. The era of the transformation of transformation. 99%, if not more, of the work the transformation part of the enterprise does is to transform operations, to make operations more effective and efficient. Some of the work the transformation part of the enterprise does is to transform support, perhaps adopting ITIL. Sometimes the transformation part of the enterprise transforms direction, perhaps rolling out iPads to directors. But we want enterprises to start to devote some resources to the transformation of the transformation part of the enterprise, because it is strategically important and will get even more so as time goes on. So here is our basic premise. The basic premise that we want the C-suite or board to understand and accept. I'll let you read these words. So, is the way your enterprise affects transformation a strategic strength or a strategic weakness? How do you know? Maturity is the key. More specifically, maturity assessment as the first step. Pragmatic have various and very detailed maturity assessment spreadsheets for enterprise architecture and for the whole of the transformation domain, of which EA is only one part. But here we offer a much higher level and we believe pragmatic initial approach to get people engaged and raise the issue to management. Here we show the overall process that begins with maturity assessment. It can be stopped at any time. Do a little work, review the output, decide whether to continue. It starts with an initial half to 1 day workshop with senior representatives from various areas of transformation, such as the CIO, head of PMO, head of business analysis, strategy and architecture, solution delivery, etc., where we can assess at a high level your level of maturity. A free report is then created that stakeholders can use to decide if there is any need to move on to dig a little deeper. If there is, the next step is to engage with representatives from all areas of transformation, business and IT, to perform a more comprehensive evaluation. Again, a report is created that stakeholders can use to decide if there is any need to move on, to determine what changes could be made to transformation. If there is, the next step is to create an action plan and estimates to design the changes to transformation and to work with leaders of the selected areas to roll those changes into live operation. If the action plan is accepted by the stakeholders, the changes are designed and then rolled out. Now for some definitions. To be able to do the workshop, we need to introduce you to some terms so we're all on the same page. When people refer to the structure of something, they often use high-level categories such as people, process and technology, or POLDAT, process, organisation, data, applications, technology. We use a new set of categories called MACE. Methods, information about what is being done and how it is being done. For example, functions, processes, practices, activities, phases, disciplines. Artifacts, information about the things that are being consumed and produced by the methods. For example, products, services, materials, information. Culture, information about the people that are being used to perform the methods. For example, people, but their values, ethics, trust and psychology also. Environment, information about the technical environment that is used to execute the methods and work with the artifacts. This environment includes information technology, which is a large part, but also includes other technologies. For example, if your company is Shell Oil, then chemical and biological technology is also very important, perhaps even more so than information technology. It is important to note that culture sits at the centre, because culture trumps everything. Magma is a set of high-level categories used to refer to transformational information. Motivation, information about the reasons why we are transforming, for example, vision, goals, objectives, requirements. Actions, information about the things we need to do in order to achieve those goals and satisfy those requirements, for example, mission, strategies, tactics, roadmaps, plans, tasks. Guidance, information about the things that will guide others as the actions are executed, for example, principles, policies, standards, rules, values, frameworks. Measures, information about the things that will allow us to know if we have achieved our goals and satisfied our requirements, for example, metrics, KPIs, CSFs, etc. Assessment, information about why we made the decisions that we did. Here we see all the phases and levels of the transformation domain. Ellipses relate to the phases of transformation where actual work is done. Rectangles relate to the levels of transformation which exist between each phase, where information created by one phase flows into the next. The phases, ellipses, are where methods are executed in the context of culture, i.e. the people and their values and ethics, etc. The levels, rectangles, is where artifacts exist, which are created and managed by the environment, namely the tools used to create and manage them. Governance is performed by each phase on the phase below, and lobbying is performed by each phase to the phase above. The black line between road mapping and initiating shows the delineation between executing projects, everything below the line that we call enterprise engineering, and everything that has to happen before we start executing projects, everything above the line. That is the domain of enterprise architecture. The Enterprise Transformation Maturity Assessment will use these phases and levels first to ask people what phases they work in, and then secondly to volunteer their views on what is good and bad in each of the phases and levels in their enterprise, and any suggestions for improvement. In order to do that, we need to define each of these phases and levels in more detail. Enterprise context is the level which relates to the information about things outside our enterprise that affect or could affect us, and the information about things outside our enterprise which we affect or we could affect. Strategizing is the phase where the C-suite, directors and executive management sit. Contextual is the level of information that they produce, such as the business or enterprise strategy, for example, mission, vision, goals, objectives, etc. Road mapping is the phase where enterprise architects and strategic transformation planners sit. Conceptual is the level of information that they produce, such as business and technical roadmaps and transformational roadmaps expressed as a portfolio of programs and projects to be executed. Initiating is the first phase of a project and where solution architects sit. Logical is the level of information that they produce, such as logical designs. Elaborating is the second phase of a project and where detailed designers sit. Physical is the level of information that they produce, such as physical designs. Constructing is the third phase of a project and where builders sit. Operational is the level of information that they produce, such as what is contained in a configuration management database, CMDB, but also the things that they have built or bought. Transitioning is the fourth phase of a project, and where things get rolled out into the physical world in terms of the methods, artifacts, culture and environment. Part of the environment, of course, is IT. Physical world is the level that corresponds to the actual physical world that change is deployed into. Governance is performed by each phase. on the phase below and make sure that each phase complies with the structural and transformational guidance coming from above. Lobbying is performed by each phase to the phase above, and make sure that any problems or opportunities that are discovered or tripped over that prevents compliance to the structural and transformational guidance coming from above are identified and raised to the correct level for a decision to accept the non-compliance and all the resulting issues and risks, or to provide what is required for compliance to be achieved. Problems and issues are addressed at the time they are discovered, rather than what usually happens, which is that they remain hidden and only come to light when large amounts of money, and more importantly time, has been wasted. The yin and yang of governance and lobbying is a massively important thing that many enterprises do not do well, and contributes massively to why at least 70% of projects fail. Pragmatic has developed a very pragmatic approach to governance and lobbying, which is easy to adopt and cheap to operate, but is outside the scope of this presentation. If you want to know more about that, please contact us. So, strategizing tries to make sure that road mapping stays aligned to the strategy, and that any problems or opportunities that are discovered are dealt with appropriately. Road mapping tries to make sure that initiating stays aligned to the roadmaps, and that any problems or opportunities that are discovered are dealt with appropriately. Initiating tries to make sure that elaboration stays aligned to the logical designs, and that any problems or opportunities that are discovered are dealt with appropriately. Elaborating tries to make sure that constructing stays aligned to the physical designs, and that any problems or opportunities that are discovered are dealt with appropriately. Constructing tries to make sure that transition stays aligned to what was bought or built, and that any problems or opportunities that are discovered are dealt with appropriately. Transitioning tries to make sure that users are aligned to what was bought or built, and that any problems or opportunities that are discovered are dealt with appropriately. The transformation domain consists of various phases with various roles being performed at various times. The transformation domain takes the output from the direction part of the enterprise at the top, strategizing, and delivers change into, mostly, the operation domain at the bottom, using. This illustrates how some common roles map to these phases of transformation to help you get a handle on the kind of work being performed in each phase. I'll just leave that there for a while for you to look at it. It is these phases that a maturity assessment can be conducted against. So, since the effectiveness and efficiency of transformation is strategically important, the first step in deciding if any resources should be spent on maturing it is to understand the current level of maturity. So, the workshop. In order to assess your enterprise transformation maturity, we utilise the Enterprise Transformation Maturity Canvas, shown here. The workshop begins with a 1-hour introduction to the ETMC and the concepts it uses, explaining them and making sure everyone is on the same page. This is the presentation you have been listening to. The rest of the time is spent facilitating a workshop, working with people to extract and categorise the most important information. At the end of the workshop there is a wash-up session, and over the following days a free report will be generated providing all the information collected, plus key findings and key recommendations. As shown here, this workshop can be done face-to-face with post-it notes, remotely using a cloud-based application, or a combination of the two. People can contribute and discuss in a meeting and at the same time collaborate with colleagues in other offices anywhere in the world. So to summarise, in today's world your transformation capability is strategically important and will either provide massive business advantage if done well, or create massive business problems if done badly. Your transformation capability has probably grown organically over time, and while it was mature enough to bring the enterprise to where it is now, it may not be mature enough to take it where it needs to go in the future. The Enterprise Transformation Maturity Canvas is a good way to begin to understand if your transformation capability has an appropriate level of maturity. Thank you for watching this presentation.